Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Heather Hying, evolutionary biologist, co-host of the Darkhorse podcast, along with her husband, Bret Weistein, and also co-author, along with Bret Weistein again, of A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. We spoke today mostly about babies, about breastfeeding, co-sleeping, sleep training, tensions between the sort of self-consciously modern and scientifically informed guides to parenting versus what intuition guides mothers to do. In the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about evolutionary history of infanticide, of why Western women seem to be more prone to postpartum depression, and why there should be more sex-specific research and guidance on diet and other kinds of health issues. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as ever, you can also find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes that I do with my husband fortnightly, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Heather, so I know that you're interested in parenting and children and mothers-fathers relationships and so on in relation to evolutionary biology, which is the subject of your last book, and that you're also interested in the perils of scientism, I guess, of seeing science as our only guiding ideology and letting go of intuition. And to me, this seems like it occurs to me that that kind of intersection between scientism and parenting is an area where we have been so frequently led astray. Like within living memory, it's really interesting when you look back at parenting books and medical guidance for parents from really not very recently, from really not that long ago, and you see the errors that have been made in terms of guidance given to parents under the guise of the very modern scientific guidance, and then we just forget it. And then a new book comes along and we say, oh no, this must definitely be true. And there's just, yes, is it? I don't know. Is it just me? Maybe I pay more attention to some of this historical parenting literature than many people do.
No, you know, it's not just you. I think it is part of the unfortunate aspect of the human condition to imagine that we are it. We have arrived. We have finally gotten to the point where we actually are omniscient and we can see all of the errors of the past, but we ourselves are not making any. And you see this in, I think, every domain. So why wouldn't it be the case, not only in every domain, but among every human being? And even those of us who are particularly attuned to it and are working hard to recognize that we are currently making errors and we just can't see them right now, we'll assume that about some things we absolutely know what we're talking about. And sometimes we're right, of course, right? But not always. And so, the thing that has happened at some level since the Enlightenment, which was a fantastic thing that happened in the West for humanity, but it started to replace religion with science. And that's not what science is. right? There is a place in humanity for religion, and there is a place in humanity for science. And I happen to be a scientist, and I'm not religious, and I can say both of those things are true. But what science was never and can never be is an authority that you follow, an authority that you trust because it came down from, in this case, it's not the people in the robes, it's the people in the lab coats. And that's absolutely not how science is. And so, the parenting advice that comes in the guise of science is more easily accepted by we moderns because we have been led to believe that when it has that imprimatur of science on it, then it must be true. And even those of us who are a bit more sophisticated than that, who say, well, I know this might not be true, but it's been vetted. Like it's gone through the process. It's gone through the scientific process. And so it has a greater chance of being true. I would hope that that is always the case, but we still make errors. So I think, formula is one of the easiest places to go for this, right? Like formula versus breast milk. The mistake, I don't even know how many fold the mistake was. The mistake was so many, but one of the mistakes was, baby is getting nutrition from breast milk. Therefore, all we have to do is replace nutrition, and that will do the trick. Like the reductionist approach to an understanding of this vastly complex human being that has evolved over billions of years, right? Says once you've discovered the thing, then that is the only thing that it's about. Well, we know now, right? We know now that breast milk isn't just about food. It's about so many other things. But there's also probably a lot of things that it's about, that it's for, that it does for baby and mother both, that we don't yet know. So we can point to that and say, oh, how foolish those people were. But which such mistakes are we making now? And another one that comes to mind is, and this one I think is still much more contentious, is family. What is called family bed, right? In the mid 20th century, and even my boys were born in 2004, 2006, and people in our family assured us that we were putting our children at risk if they slept with us as babies. And that's not the case, right? Unless a mother is on heavy drugs or drunk or in bed with someone who's on heavy drugs or drunk and is actually so out of touch with the world that they could roll over on a child and not notice, then it's not a risk. And you have a young one. That you couldn't possibly, in anything like your right mind, be on top of your child and not notice, right? And in fact, your results will vary. All children are different. All parents are different. All families are different. But many of the challenges that very young parents have, that parents of very young children have, end up amounting to being sleep deprived. And a lot of that can be alleviated by allowing your baby to nurse on demand and just being willing to sleep with your baby nursing and allow him or her to fall asleep again once he is sated. And it's not like sleep before you had a child, but then nothing's like it was before you had a child. You know this now. And I never proselytized before I had kids. I didn't know, right? You don't know. And I still don't proselytize, but the fact is that everything changes and your values change. And are you gonna hurt your child by sleeping with them? No, it's actually going to be good for both of you.
The anti-co-sleeping messaging that you get from now, I don't know if you have the same organization in the US, but we have an organization called the Lullaby Trust, which is an anti-sudden infant death syndrome education charity, and you get all the leaflets from your midwives and so on. And they do actually, if you kind of dig down into the website, they do actually have guides to safe co-sleeping, which is things like don't have excess bedding on the bed, make sure that you're not taking sleeping pills, all this sort of sensible stuff. But you really have to dig down. Their top line message is basically do not co-sleep. And it's clearly coming from a good place, and there has been a drop in SIDS deaths, which may or may not be related to official guidance. We don't really know, because sort of the nature of SIDS is that it's very mysterious. but I remember when I've had my son, and I had another friend who had a baby within weeks of me, and we just tortured ourselves by reading about SIDS guidance and reading all the data there was. Just was terrified. It's the most terrifying thing you can be told as a mother, that you might just have your child snatched from you, particularly when your instinct is to co-sleep. And both of us did end up co-sleeping, but in a guilty sort of way, right? Because we've been advised against it, but held off for as long as possible. And in retrospect, we were exactly the sort of highly educated, not smoking, not drinking, not taking drugs, any of this, like the lowest risk possible people, and also the most likely to read all the literature and to terrorize ourselves by reading all the literature. And of course, the mothers who are most likely to actually hurt their children through co-sleeping aren't reading any of that. It's so misdirected, all of this education campaign, because it's not. I don't think it's actually really reaching the families who are most at risk, but it is causing an enormous amount of grief for
and fear, right? Like,
and fear.
This most magical and never to return part of your life and your baby's life, the first days, weeks, months, to be living in fear because authorities whom you do not know and will never meet have decided that there is an answer that is known is, I don't know that it's criminal, but it's certainly not kind. And I think it's dangerous. There's an excellent book actually that we cite in Hunter Gatherer's Guide, which you mentioned up front here, the book that my husband Bret and I co-wrote, a book called The Anthropology of Childhood, which is a compendium.
I have it on my shelf right now. I love that book.
It's wonderful. And the subtitle is something like Cherubs, Chattel, and Changelings. I don't remember if that's the order that it comes in, but that's his. So it's the researcher, as you know, has basically reviewed the anthropological literature on childhood. And as he points out, it's hard. There isn't nearly as much known about children as there are about adults. And just as it's hard for male anthropologists to go in and really understand what the women in a particular culture are, because often they're not invited in, it's difficult for any adult anthropologist to go in and really understand what the children are doing. And children anthropologists don't exist, although when anthropologists' families go into places, their children probably understand more. But his point, the author whose name I've forgotten, is he categorizes cultures into three ways of treating children: as cherubs, right? As rather as we in the weird world do, as children who can do no wrong and need to be protected from all harm; as chattel, as little workhorses, and the sooner that you can get them to work, the better; and as changelings, who will start out as one thing and become another. And it's not quite as binary as started as cherubs and become chattel, but as things that start out really not quite of this world, but they will become human at some point. And even that, and I don't know that I exactly agree with the categorization. It's a little bit too restrictive, as almost all categorizations are. But recognizing that our weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic approach to childhood and parenting is but one. Like there is a history of many other ways of dealing with children. And frankly, ours is relatively new and it's become quite prominent, but it is not the only way to raise children. And it is not by any measure inherently the best. And I think, although, this is not within the purview of that book, I would hypothesize that this rise of scientism and trust the person in the lab coat or with the credentials or whatever, who comes and makes pronouncements about what you should do with your children, will have a greater chance of rising in societies that treat their children like these precious little beings, as cherubs in essence. That we can't. It's more difficult for us within the confines of this society to say, you know what? No, I mean, just as you report with your friend who had a child within weeks of your own, maybe the more educated we are, the harder it is to say, I'm not going to listen to that. Like I am quite certain that my instinct here, my intuition as a mother, as a human being, so I think it was a bit easier for me, because I was also trained as a scientist and specifically an evolutionary biologist. And my work has been on the evolution of sexual selection and parental care and social systems and thinking about how other organisms do these things. And, I did a lot of research when I was pregnant for the first time on, okay, what actually are the risks of coffee, of goat cheese, of, undercooked meats, like, the dietary stuff. And I assumed that all of the novel molecules that we run into in our environment were going to be bad for me, and I was going to try to stay away from them, paint thinners and such. But the behavioral advice so clearly has changed so often, and it almost never comes through an evolutionary lens, that it was easy to say, you know what, I just don't think these people know what they're talking about. And not to say that they aren't, as you say, well-intentioned, but that doesn't make them right. And that doesn't mean we should listen to them.
I guess one of the things I've learned from going through it and from seeing friends go through the experience of having children is that fixing yourself to any given parenting ideology is probably a bad idea, because children are extremely different from one another, and an approach that works with one child will not necessarily work with another. And so I don't sign up to any particular, say, attachment parenting or whatever. I do think, though, that I think that we underemphasize intuition and we overemphasize data. And an example I thought of when you were speaking just now is, I don't know if you've read Emily Oster at all. She's a very popular. Her work's really good. I have no real complaint against her approach, except that it is it might sometimes veer into scientism. So she's written, I think, at least a couple of books on pregnancy and on parenting, which is about all the data relating to everything. As you say, the coffee and the goat's cheese and the and all the. She really looks into all the warnings, in particular, given to pregnant women. Very popular books right now for women who are having their kids right now. Very popular books among highly educated women. And it is useful. It's things like, actually, coffee isn't dangerous. It's just that women who have morning sickness tend to not like drinking coffee. And so that sort of creates an artifact in the data where it seems as if coffee causes miscarriages. Anyway, that's all very useful. But I remember reading her describing how she'd been struggling to get her baby to sleep, quite young baby. And she'd done all the reading and found that the most data-backed way of getting a child to sleep is sleep training through cry it out. And so she did that, and that meant she found the sound of her baby crying so distressing and caused her such physical discomfort that she had to leave her husband in their house and go out, because she just couldn't bear to hear the baby cry, couldn't bear it. And I thought, and I had the same thing. I didn't do cry it out for that reason, because I just couldn't bear it. And I thought, isn't that evidence? Isn't your intuition around finding the whole process incredibly upsetting, which is basically what everyone who does cry it out reports? Isn't that, it might not be quantitative, but isn't that evidence of something? Shouldn't we put that on the ledger somewhere, right? Doesn't intuition count for something?
Absolutely. And intuition is not anti-scientific either, right? So the scientism of modernity and the things that are passing for science are often just one part of the scientific process. Like data and measurement and figuring out what to measure, that is 100% part of the scientific process. But how is it that we get our ideas in the first place? And what are our hypotheses that are alternative to one another? Where did they come from? There's no method for that. That is intuition. That is creative spark. That is, it came to me while on a walk, in the shower, whatever, right? And I'm hardly the first person to say this. Is Richard Feynman and Einstein and Blaise Pascal, all of these, remarkable thinkers are pointing out, what, this is science is all that in many ways, but it is not the narrow thing that you are pointing to with regard to science. So evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology more broadly, but evo psych in particular is often accused of being sort of adaptive arm waving. Like you tell these just so stories and there's no way to assess whether or not they're true. And that is a weakness of trying to understand human behavior because we are unwilling to do the experiments, right? We are unwilling to actually experiment, especially on babies and young people in the way that you would have to know with the same degree of certainty that we think we know some things about non-fraught subjects. And even then, we're often wrong. But if your body is like is painful to you as you hear your child's cries, your body is telling you something. Absolutely, it is. And now let's think about this from the perspective of the baby. The baby is learning that mom isn't always there. And when I need mom, when I, and, and to some degree, dad will do, right? Two parent homes are better than one parent homes for sure. But dads can't do everything for a newborn, right? We know this. And even pumped milk that came out of the fridge and was rewarmed that a dad gives through a bottle is not the same. It's just not the same as breastfeeding from the breast with mom. There are lots of things that are okay, but not the same. So dads don't report. Anecdotally, I feel like this is true, but I think this will hold. Dads don't report the same kind of extreme pain when they hear their babies crying. They don't like it. Bonded dads who are bonded with their babies don't like it, but they don't feel that aching. I have to go. I have to go to him. I have to go to her now, right? So why would you teach yourself to ignore that when what at the same time what you're teaching your baby is no one will come for me? Like the prediction would be a baby who had to cry it out is going to have a harder time having secure attachment later on and will be more likely to run to mom's skirts at the first drop off at school or daycare or whatever it is, because what that baby learned as an infant was sometimes mom doesn't come back. And obviously, if you're dropping your kid at daycare, you did come back, but I called for mom and she wasn't there. And then finally I fell asleep. And obviously none of this is conscious for a baby, but finally I fell asleep. And when I woke up, well, there she was again. But that felt like this disconnect. Like that wasn't part of the same story. All I know is I needed her and she wasn't there. And the fact is that as children grow, that logic changes, right? Like just like you say, you can't have static rules. You can't have static rules almost anywhere. But in parenting, what works now isn't necessarily going to work definitely won't work in 10 years. Probably won't work in 1 year. May not, depending on the age of the child, may not work in a month or a week or a day even. And that's in part because they are developing, but it's also in part because they, like you, are human and they are reading your signs. And no matter how much love there is between you and your child, they're going to try to game you because that's part of what growing up is. And so, if you have a static rule and they're trying to figure out how to game you, they're going to figure out how to do it. And that's not what you want. You want to be a loving, strong presence that doesn't have your kid making the rules, right? The kids aren't supposed to be making the rules. So I think we get confused when, if I say the kid shouldn't be making the rules, but definitely respond to your newborn when he cries, that's not inconsistent because what your child is changing over time. Everyone who's been a parent, and frankly, everyone who hasn't, can intuit this, that how you interact with a 2-week-old and a 2-month-old and a 2-year-old and a 12-year-old is very, very different. And responding to everything that a 2-month-old or a 6-month-old asks of you is loving, and responding to everything that a 2-year-old or a 6-year-old asks of you is not. Like that's you being tricked potentially, and forming a relationship that won't be as effective and wonderful later on. But when they're 2 months old, when all they know, or they can't even roll over yet, and maybe, I don't remember the developmental stages, but at some point, maybe they've begun to smile, maybe not. What they need is food, and to be clean and dry, and to be loved, and to feel you, and to feel your love, both literally and metaphorically, as much as possible.
You mentioned breastfeeding and formula earlier, which is another, I mean, it's also an area which can be so difficult to talk about because of maternal guilt, and and I it's so important to say that formula is life-saving technology, and it's amazing that we have been able to develop formula which is similar enough to breast milk that children survive who would not otherwise survive. So on that count, it is wonderful. But one of the things which I find very alarming in looking at fairly recent history of parenting guidance is period, particularly in the mid 20th century, when mothers were advised against breastfeeding by their doctors. I think this was particularly true in the States, and it was a very aspirational sort of thing to do because formula was presented as being preferable. It was the more modern food stuff, and breastfeeding was, I don't know, maybe there was also some gross out factor that people just turned against breastfeeding for other reasons. But we've now obviously come full circle on that, but we've never quite managed we still have very low breastfeeding rates all across the Western world because we've never quite managed to move mothers away from formula. And yes, that has a lot to do with the fact that formula is more convenient. Formula is more convenient at the beginning when you're trying to establish breastfeeding. Formula can seem like the easy option. It's actually not the easy option once you're established and breastfeeding becomes super easy. But there are circumstances where it's more convenient. But also, I think because we've had this sort of fire break, that because when modern kinds of formula were introduced, you had this real plummet in the number of women breastfeeding. You now end up with a situation where you have so many grandmothers and mothers who can't teach their daughters how to do it. And it's actually not that intuitive. And if there aren't other support mechanisms in place from the state, or, a lot of women just won't. They'll come across some problem during establishing breastfeeding, and they won't know how to fix it. And it turns out that actually you need this generation upon generation cultural transmission process to make that work. And when you have a break, you can just lose it.
I had never thought of that, actually. The cultural break that was so much of the 20th century from so many of our ways. The era of formula was also the era of margarine, right? This was everything that was coming from the lab scientists and arrived neatly wrapped in plastic was definitely safer for you than anything that came out of a human breast or a cow, in the case of breast milk or butter, right? And I think what you call the gross out factor was used by the marketers for sure. Like, why exudate for, like, what is that, right? And it's true. If you think too long and hard about almost anything that we eat other than fruit, right? You can get a little squeamish, but that's the nature of being alive. Like, that's the nature of being an evolved organism. And the only thing we eat that didn't come from a living organism is salt, and you can't live on salt, right? And so you're going to be taking the hard-won tissues of some organism and putting it into your body. And as a baby, it's just, we are named our one of our clades, one of the clades that we belong to, obviously mammals, is named for, our eponymous trait is having these mammary glands, and it's not the only thing that makes us unique. And just a little evolutionary aside, we evolved mammary glands before we evolved nipples. And so early on, we still have a few representatives on the planet, the echidnas and the duck-billed platypus, that ooze milk out of just slits in their ventral side and their stomachs, but they don't actually have nipples. So it's rather less efficient and more messy, and just sort of a trickle of milk down the body. And so, even this thing that feels, messy and, archaic, has a messier and more archaic form still out there on the planet. It is like so much of parenting, at least this was my experience, so miraculous and wonderful. And like I've said elsewhere, but I think I haven't said here, I was, for reasons that I'm not clear on, very interested in how parental care evolves and what clades and in what organisms and why. What are the conditions under which mothers, or rarely only fathers, or more rarely than mothers, but more common than only fathers, mothers and fathers both, raise children together, like actually take care of their young, as opposed to put two gametes together and scram and never see their kids again. So I was always very, very interested in that, but I didn't feel myself the maternal urge. And my husband, who's also Bret Weistein, who's also an evolutionary biologist, and I always felt that, well, yes, we should at some point. We're going to want that. The phrase is, we're going to want to have had kids, but neither of us felt the urge, actually. And then and for me, pregnancy was hard. I just didn't like it at all. I didn't like being taken over and not being able to do the things that I like to do, which involve physical risk, and which I couldn't, I was not going to do while pregnant. And as soon as each of my boys was born, my entire view on it changed. Right. As soon as I held those babies in my arm, and I was lucky. It was easy. It was easy for me. That part was easy. They latched on quickly, and it was a bond quickly. And I know that's not the case for a lot of women, but it felt like, oh, how do you explain this? How do you explain this to people who haven't experienced it? And I don't 100% know. Right? It is something that is different from any other kind of love that you can experience, and that's not to denigrate or rank the kinds of love that we have. But, well, as Bret and I write about in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide, mother's love is going to have been the first one, right? And just because it was first doesn't mean it's the best. Again, this is not a rank order in terms of value judgment, but that feeling between mother and baby. And it is both ways, even though we can't ask the babies. It is both ways, is the thing that makes us who we are. It's what makes us mammals, and our very, very long childhoods is one of the most distinct things about us being humans. That's not an error. That's not something we just have to live with. That's because it takes that long for us as parents and their extended family, and in turn their friend group, to teach these tiny babies that we create how to be human.
You use a line in your book which is almost exactly the same as a line used by Adrienne Rich in the book of Woman Born. I don't know if you've read it, which I think was published
It's been a long time.
Yeah, like 1980 or sometime like that, where she describes maternal love as the great original source of love. And I don't think that she's referring to it in evolutionary terms, as you describe, the fact that this romantic love ended up imitating maternal love, right? And then so on down in terms of love of friends and love of abstract nouns, right? But that it all comes back eventually to maternal love. She's right. That is the great original source of love, and it is, I guess, qualitatively different in the sense that it also entails such acute vulnerability, which isn't really true for any other type of love, because you know that your baby is utterly dependent on you, which is where, of course, the baby's cry is causing this physical distress comes from.
Right. I mean, it's a different vulnerability, right? Because your baby, presumably, if everything has gone more or less right, has an unconditional love for you and an unconditional bond. And unless you do something to break that, it's there. And it will change, right? The baby will develop and become ornery, right? Whereas a romantic love, no matter how deep and enduring, is never unconditional in that way. And certainly at the beginning of a relationship, unlike, in some ways, a romantic love becomes more dependent, becomes closer to unconditional the longer, the deeper, the more enduring it is. Whereas the love between mother and child, it goes in the opposite direction, and it doesn't hopefully ever become conditional. But the strange role of the parent is to give the child more and more freedom and always provide a home base that they know they can come back to, so that they can go out and take risks. And God forbid that those risks result in death or disability, but it will happen sometimes to some children. But without those risks, if what you do is just wrap your kid up until they're 18 and then say, aha, you're an adult now, go out. Nope, no, they're not. They can't be. because they've never seen anything, right? So getting out into the world, which is going to look different at 2 years and at 6 years and at 12 years, right? And figuring out what that world is and having that child know for sure, no matter how old they are, that actually you always have home here. This is home. You always have this to come back to. I am always your mother. I will always be your mother, and our relationship will change and your situation will change. But that is true. Regardless of whether or not I live where you grew up, where I raised you, wherever I am, you are home. And that message alone for a child to know, even if you've never say it. I don't think I've ever said that explicitly to my children. But I think if you said those words to them and they said, "Do you think your mom feels this way and your dad?" They'd say, "Yeah, for sure." And and that's it. Okay, home is here. Now go out and do your thing on the world. Like, be amazing and productive and do good for people.
I guess the only dark exception to thinking again about Adrienne Rich's book, to the unconditional maternal love, that it's only really in the very, very earliest stages of infancy, is infanticide, which we know is a common thread in human history. Women do sometimes, for adaptive reasons, maybe sometimes for non-adaptive reasons, I don't know, decide not to care for a baby. And Adrienne Rich does have a whole chapter on infanticide. I think it's one of her last chapters, actually, because it is obviously this like one great, very great exception to the great original source of love story of motherhood.
And we can understand infanticide as an extension of abortion. And that's a horrible and, to some people, utterly repugnant thing to say. To those who are anti-choice, it's the obvious thing to say. I am not, but I also recognize that is, I'm not anti-choice. I'm pro-choice, but not until term, right? Like not certainly until that child could be living outside of the body of their mother. That said, I recognize from the anthropological literature, and to some degree from what I've seen in my research and my travels around the world, that some women are in untenable situations, and some cultures tolerate this. And I'm grateful that ours doesn't. I'm grateful that ours mostly doesn't tolerate abortion in the third trimester, or even largely, mostly in the second. But there are all of these lines that we can draw between moments, and time is an easy place to mark things. And so we have things like, you can't drink before you're 18 or 21, depending on where you are. You can't be conscripted into the military. You can't drive. Like these, we pick moments, we pick birthdays, because we recognize that those are moments that are unnegotiable, that everyone can point to it and say, this is what your birth certificate says, therefore this is how many times around the sun you have been living. But we know that people develop at different rates, and that one person's 18-year-old is not going to have the same maturity as another 18-year-old. And so, the choice, the arguments over choice, which are of course extraordinarily fraught in the U.S. in particular, often end up coming down to, insanely, I think, the two moments that are most discrete: fertilization and birth, which, at least you can note. You can either there were two gametes or there was a zygote. That's one moment. Either the baby was inside or outside. That's another moment. And those being the most easily observable discrete moments do not make either of them the right moment to have be the line. And that said, this emerges because you raised infanticide. I'm glad that I have never been in a situation where I had to observe or even indirectly know that such a thing was happening in my sphere, in my presence. But I do understand it as part of the continuum of choices, of terrible choices that mothers sometimes have to make. And I see many cases of abortion like that as well.
And indeed, I did a bit of research work as a graduate student on attitudes towards infanticide in early modern England. Speaking of, actually, historically, the other sharp line that was introduced, within pregnancy, but it's a line that is dependent on the mother's subjective experience, is quickening, i.e.,
Yeah.
the first kick. And very often that was considered when pregnancy actually began, because of course when you don't have the technology to
And
detect a
when is
pregnancy.
that? That's like 16, 20 weeks, something really mid. When-ish is that?
I think the end of the first trimester,
Oh, it's early.
maybe
Okay.
maybe
Okay.
slightly beyond. Well, it will vary quite a lot, which is why it isn't a very going back to the theme at the beginning, isn't a very scientific measure. But it does. It's basically somewhere around the end of the first trimester, which of course is actually the point where most Americans and most Brits think that abortion ought to be limited. There is this feeling that first trimester is different, and even though we don't define that based on quickening, that is also what many of our ancestors thought as well. Our Christian ancestors who condemned abortion didn't necessarily see a woman doing something, not taking abortifacients necessarily, but say hot baths in a first trimester was not really condemned, but obviously trying to affect a miscarriage after quickening was quite different. But anyway, on the infanticide question, there are different legal regimes at different times in English history and so on. But one of the things that's quite consistent, actually, is the deep reluctance of juries to convict women of infanticide.
Oh, that's interesting.
That even when there's very clear evidence, and this is often in accounts, at least that I came across, with servant girls, because servants are so vulnerable, right? A young woman going to live on her own in the house of unrelated employers is an inherently risky setup for exactly this reason. And so you have servant girls getting pregnant, committing infanticide, and juries, technically, very often, capital punishment is the punishment, but juries won't give it to them, almost always. So I think there does seem to be built in that feeling like it is wrong, it is bad, but people are reluctant really to condemn the women.
Of course, the situation that you describe is two things, right? There's also rape or something lesser than that is potentially involved. Whether or not a servant girl who gets pregnant when she is alone in a house of people whom she is working for may actually have fallen in love with someone, but it's also true that she is unlikely to be able to say no to someone who's very persistent, who is her employer, and when she has no place else to go. And so I guess I would love to know. I would love to know, in cases where there is no evidence of possible coercion, coerced sex that resulted in the pregnancy, if juries were still less willing to impose the maximum penalty on mothers.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.